are to listen and accompany. But I'm very excited to be here tonight with two queer spiritual leaders. And yes, Chaplain Claire Chuck Bohman and Reverend Daigan Gather. Gaither. Thank you. Yes. Yes. I even asked ahead and I still messed them up. So, I get nervous. Okay. The first spiritual practice, being willing to make mistakes. Now, both of you have beautifully developed areas of expertise, serving the wider world and especially the queer community, and especially at intersections of queer identity and spirituality, and all the ways those mix together. I would love it, and you each have microphones, and so that the folks online can hear us, we need to talk into them. But I would like perhaps to start with you, Claire. If you could talk a little bit about your current chaplaincy practice and where it's located and the many multifaceted things you do.
Thanks, John. It's such a privilege to be here with you all. First of all, I just want to say I hate public speaking. So I'm just going to name that right here and ask for your generosity and compassion as I work an edge. So I'm the Director of Spiritual Care at Sojourn Chaplaincy, which is the multi-faith spiritual care department at the San Francisco General Hospital and Trauma Center here in the city. And we're also the city's only safety net hospital. And so that means that folks who don't have insurance, can't receive care other places, sometimes because they've been kicked out of other hospitals, receive care at the general. So the hospital is the facility that really catches the folks who are falling through the cracks at other healthcare facilities and in our system. And we do spiritual and emotional support for folks in the hospital and also in some of the Department of Public Health clinics. And as you know, this is a city with many LGBT folks, and so very privileged to get to serve a lot of folks in the community through my work at the hospital. We also have a chaplaincy training program there, and so we train chaplains and spiritual care folks in doing spiritual care community leaders. And I'm an herbalist. That's another hat I wear. I have a private practice that's kind of been pared down a little bit in the pandemic, and serve folks through that practice, and also practice earth-based religion with a couple different communities, kind of, I think, like water like that. But makes sense because I'm the president of the Temple of the Waters, which we're based in Santa Cruz, and we do ritual and ceremony, mostly online these days in the pandemic, but starting to meet in person again.
Don't forget where Sojourn started, though.
Oh, thank you, Daigon. Full disclosure, Daigon is on the board of Sojourn, so we get to work together, which is fantastic. And I'm so glad you brought that up. So, as you know, in the early 1980s, there was a mysterious disease killing mostly gay men here in San Francisco, and there were religious leaders that were refusing to meet with these people because they were gay. And there was an Episcopal priest who said, this is fucked up. And so she started organizing clergy.
Saying something is fucked up is a form of prayer.
Yeah.
By the
Amen.
way, especially
Amen.
Engaging in advocacy and changing systems. First naming that it's fucked up is a prayer. So
yeah, absolutely. It's part of how change happens. And so she said, this is fucked up. And so she started organizing clergy, first within the Episcopal Church, then started reaching out in Baptist congregations here in San Francisco, and then it kind of spread into different religious traditions, and developed the first AIDS ministry training program. And in the early parts of the epidemic, Sojourn trained hundreds, if not thousands, of clergy in providing supportive and compassionate care to people who were dying of AIDS. And as the pandemic shifted, and folks started living longer in this country. Many services that had emerged during the epidemic, we kind of turned around the organization and said, well, wait, hold on, there's a whole hospital here that could use a lot of support. And so that program evolved and shifted into a community chaplaincy training program. And we've been doing that for 40 years. This is our 40th anniversary year, which is pretty exciting. And then 5 years ago, with the support and working alongside trans clergy and spiritual leaders and community leaders here in the Bay Area, and some folks in other parts of the country, developed the Trans Spiritual Care Initiative, and we do gender diversity training and education, mostly for chaplains and clergy, but we found that actually a lot of healthcare providers like getting gender diversity training from clergy and community members too. So we kind of have like a motley crew of folks that we've trained through our program. And we're actually doing a training tomorrow, so I'll leave a flyer on the table back there, and you guys can join us if you'd like.
Beautiful, thank you. I love hearing about how the spiritual needs of the queer community ended up, when we pay attention to folks who are on the margins, caring for them ends up caring for all. Yeah.
But that's the nature of any communities at the margins, right? Like if we can bring ourselves to the margins and take care of the people at the margins, everybody benefits, right? And I think that often gets overlooked when we're talking about whether it's people at the racial margins, class margins, all of that. Like if we can lift up the poor, everybody benefits, right? And that's the thing about intersectionality too. Like, there are poor queer people, there are poor trans people, like all of these things, like everything that we do as clergy people, if we forget that it exists in the margins and that it also exists in these intersections, right? And that it's our responsibility to then meet that spot, right? Okay, so I'll tell you my story. My name is Reverend Daigan Gather. I'm a Soto Zen Buddhist priest and a chaplain. And my spiritual journey sort of started during the AIDS epidemic. I came out in the late 70s. And when AIDS was happening, I found myself at people's bedsides a lot. And my friends would call me and say, hey, I have a friend who's dying. Would you come visit? Because for some reason, I got really good at talking to people in these places. And then after I lost my second circle of friends, I moved up to San Francisco to leave LA because my partner had died, and I kept finding myself in the parking lot of the hospital that he died at, and it was like, I have to leave. I can't do this anymore. So I came up here and then found out that there's this thing called chaplaincy that is an actual thing that you could do this as a job. And before that, I was an engineer. And I also was having my own kind of crisis of faith, my own I was doing a lot of my own healing work, which led me into learning about meditation and learning about Buddhism. I was raised in an evangelical Christian family, super ultra conservative, which led to a lot of pain and suffering. And as I healed that, I started to really think about what is it that I believe and that matters to me. And particularly as I started to investigate, like, oh, I could do this for a living, so then maybe I need to find a spiritual community and all of those things. And I had been out so long that I wasn't really willing to go back in the closet for spiritual. And so, so that sort of led me into this path of Buddhism and Zen in particular. And partially because of one of the tenets of Zen is that you already are enlightened. You don't have to create something special. You're already awakened. And so that's so beneficial, I think, for those of us who have been harmed spiritually to be told
Yes.
that you don't need me to give you anything, right? Like, I just am here as a teacher. I teach, but it's mostly I mirror, right? Like, I just tell you what your own heart is already telling you when I meet with my students, or even when I'm working with patients, right? So now I work, I don't work for an agency, I work freelance, and mostly it's for people who can't afford to pay. I believe that capitalism is the bane of our existence, and so everything I do
Amen.
is outside of a capitalist model. So everything is by donation, whether it's my teaching, whether it's a workshop, retreats, all of that, and my chaplaincy work. So families reach out to me because somebody's Buddhist and they're dying, and they heard that I will meet with them and that I don't charge, that I'll work with anybody, and so then I meet with them. And so that's sort of how I operate in the world. And
Thank you.
I think that's
That was
enough for now.
gorgeous. I appreciate a number of topics that you touched upon in sharing some of your history, because that story of religious wounds, wounds from our faith communities of origins, are very common across the LGBTQIA plus experience. And I'm wondering if the two of you might say more about those wounds. One of the reasons why we wanted to have a panel with Claire, Chuck, and Daigon is that we know that frequently when we have these panels, when we talk about queer faith and spirituality in this culture, it frequently becomes all about Christianity. And it was important to center people who are not practicing in that space for tonight. But if you could talk a little bit about your sort of origin stories and what you see with the queer folk that you serve as some commonalities potentially of experience.
Sure. Well, I think it's like how do you give the long story short? I come from a long line of Catholics on both sides, but my parents, left the church. I was baptized Catholic mostly because my Roman Irish Catholic grandmother would have literally committed a crime had I not been baptized, And my parents, after years of my very religious grandmother nagging at my parents and saying, you gotta take those kids to church or they're gonna go to hell, my parents decided to start attending the Unitarian Universalist Church in Arlington, Virginia, where I grew up. And I think the free childcare was a big part of it. The thing about the Unitarian Universalist community and the way they do religious education, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but religious education for the children is a lot like some people believe this, other people believe this, some people believe this. What do you believe? When fourth grade was like holidays every weekend. It was a religious holiday from some tradition, which was a great way to learn about different religions because it was like a party every weekend. It's awesome when you're 9. When I learned about witchcraft, I was like, oh, I'm a witch. Yeah, totally. I'm a witch. That's me. So I went to the bookstore and stole some books and got some herbs out of the cabinet and, found some candles and started doing spells like you do. And one day I came home and my parents had all my stuff on the living room floor. And I was like, oh, man, I'm busted. And they were like, Claire, if you're interested in witches, there's witches at the church. And I was like, huh? Well, like, you should go meet with them. And I was like, okay. And, I was like 10 or 11 at this point. I went and met with, Joan Gelbein, who was our Jewish ecofeminist minister at the UU church. And she gave me a copy of Starhawk's Spiral Dance and Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon, which if any of you are familiar with that book, it's like that thick. I can't believe that the minister gave me like a 10-year-old that book. I look back on that in my life and I'm just like, wow. So I had a really privileged experience as a young person of having elders and teachers to teach me magic and earth-based practice, and had community to practice with. Because of that, I had role models as a queer person. I grew up around, it's an open and affirming congregation and community. And the thing about the pagan group at the UU Church in Virginia, some pagan groups are more integrated within the UU Church. Sometimes the pagans are more integrated into the congregation. In the South and the southeastern parts of the United States, most of them are practicing in the UU Church, or at least in the 90s, were practicing in the UU Church mostly to have a safe place, to not get killed. You know what I mean? To not get harassed, to not get targeted. It was kind of a safe place to gather more publicly. So I came out at a young age, figured that out pretty early on, came out in middle school, and had a pretty decent experience initially when I came out with a small group of friends, and then I got to high school, and I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but I was outed, both as a witch and as queer. So there was a very well-organized Christian youth group in my high school called Young Life. Maybe some of you have heard of it, or maybe some of you participated in it. They would do things like have pizza parties and not tell you what you were going to. So people, and I always wanted to eat when I was younger. Anytime anybody was but I knew, don't go to the pizza party, with the Young Life people, because they would kind of corner you and try to convert you, and it was a whole thing. And anyway, they put me on a list of kids to pray for when I was just a month or two into high school, and effectively outed me to everybody in the high school, because I was a lesbian witch. And I was like, I'm actually a bisexual pagan, but okay.
Let me offer some spiritual education right now.
Yeah. I didn't get hurt physically, in high school. I got lucky. I had some friends who were in gangs, and I think that really helped. I got yelled scripture at, and people threatened me, and spit on me, and all of that. It was not fun. Maybe you've had similar experiences in your life. But I think, you talk about the wounding of the church, and so many queer folks are coming with wounds from their experience within the church. I think it's also important to acknowledge, how many of us also have wounds from outside of the church,
Yes.
Nothing quite hurts like Christian love.
Right. Yeah, it took me a long time to get that, because I've often reflected on what were those adults thinking? What were they thinking to do that to a bunch of teenagers, to put a bunch of teenagers on a list, and years later, after Katrina, I went down to New Orleans and was doing, the long story short, did some work down there, came back, then was doing anti-racism training for volunteers who were going down there from the Bay Area. Also doing work here to try to help survivors either get back to New Orleans, because a lot of folks, there's a large community, particularly African-American community from the New Orleans area, here in the Bay Area. And so, both trying to help folks get back was part of the Bay to Gulf pipeline, is what we were called. And we were trying to help people get back or help them get established here in the Bay Area post-Katrina. And I was doing some work at some drive at a church in the Bayview. It was a Baptist church. And it was great. There was a youth group, and, we were organizing, and, they were putting stuff together. I was nervous about going into a church, but, anyway, there was the youth group who was organizing the clothing drive and everything like that, and I said, "Oh, is this the church youth group?" to the older person who was there, and he was like, "Oh no, we're Young Life." And I was like, "Wow." I think it for me, it was kind of like, this is really more complicated. I think for me, it complicated it, because I think as a white person, who was doing solidarity work and trying to support, Black folks who had been pushed out by capitalism. Really, I mean, I think there's a whole lot I could say about Katrina, and it's a whole other conversation, I think. But there was a way that experience was profoundly healing for me, because it was like, here was this youth group that was doing so much good work to support these kids in the community. And these kids, like, they had no problem with me being a big old homo. You know what I mean? There was like a lot of room for me in that congregation, just as somebody who was doing work alongside them. And so it complicated my thinking. I think up until that point, I was like, young life, like had a visceral response in my body around it. So anyway, I'm not trying to say Young Life is some fantastic organization. This statement brought to you by.
But I appreciate your ability to talk about those complications as people following spiritual paths who maybe have had traumatic experiences in other paths and other traditions previously. Thank you.
Well, and I think that also as chaplains, right, like I don't serve just Buddhists, right? I would say 80% of the people I serve are Christian. So if I still carried around my wounding from my childhood, that's going to bleed over in my ability to serve, right? And as chaplains, I think we're called to serve in a particular kind of way. And I like to, when I'm training other chaplains, one of the things I tell them is that my practice brings me to the bedside. What happens there is about the person that I'm serving. It's my practice that makes it possible for me to serve, but the service has to center someone besides me. So my story, I grew up on a horse ranch in southern Texas, ultra-conservative, evangelical Christians, racist, and was kicked out when I was 16 because I was told that I could either go to reparative therapy or I could leave. So I left. I don't know where I got the courage from, because honestly, I had been sort of raised and trained. My family are also sort of, anybody who recognizes my last name might recognize some of my family members. In Christian traditions, they're fairly well known. And so I left, and I was sort of being raised to be a minister, right? Like that was supposed to be my job. And for some reason, I just thought, nothing's broken. I don't need to be repaired. Like, I don't know what your problem is, but this isn't about me. So I left and traveled around, got drunk a lot, all of those things, right? And I always sort of had a desire for spiritual connection. And by the time I was 22, I started to try to figure out how to not shoot heroin anymore. So I found my way into 12-step recovery, where I found a relationship again to spirituality. And one of the things that I did, I stopped doing drugs and drinking in the Pacific Northwest, and there's a very strong indigenous community in the Pacific Northwest that I somehow got connected to. I think I was dating a boy at one point who was indigenous, and so I got involved in this, and I was...
Sometimes boys can be a really excellent introduction to a spiritual community.
I followed my dick everywhere for a very long time. So anyway, so I was in a sweat lodge and with a bunch of people, and we were cleaning up, and one of the elders there just sort of looked at me and said, "You really need to clean up the Christian stuff." And so I started to think about what that would mean. Like, what would it look like to heal that part of myself? And so I did a lot of study, and I did a lot of work. And then, and that included visiting queer churches and UU churches and talking to lots of people, including like a Carmelite nun named Macrina Whitaker wrote this book called A Tree Full of Angels that really spoke to me in this way. So I wrote her a letter telling my story, and she wrote back this really lovely letter that just sort of said, I think you need to just trust whatever God is telling you, and like, don't listen to the people around you so much. Which, for a Catholic nun who, Carmelites live in seclusion, so it was kind of a, super ultra Catholic, right? So yeah, so that's, I started the healing journey, and then fast forward to moving to San Francisco and having a bit of an emotional meltdown around not being able to work. My own health had started to decline. All of my friends were dead, but the cocktails started to happen and people were living, and I was like, what the fuck am I supposed to do now? And all of that. And a friend and I decided that we live in San Francisco, where every spiritual faith tradition that you could possibly imagine exists here. So we were going to go explore to find, whatever the spiritual solution was. And this was also right around the time I started to join the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Yay! Let's give a shout out to the nuns in the back.
Whoop,
Sister
whoop.
May Joy be with you, and Sister Garden O'Pansies. We love them. So I found myself in a Buddhist meditation thing, and the guy in front of the group, after we meditated, sort of said this thing that kind of pissed me off, so I wanted to understand more about what he was saying so I could argue with him and tell him how wrong he was. So I kept coming back, and that led me to, and then right around that same time too, I also started to get involved with Zen Hospice Project as a volunteer, because I felt like I needed to relate to grief in a different kind of way. Because for me, I had spent the last 20 years grieving and not really knowing, like I did all the things, right? Like I went to therapy, I did all the support groups, I did all the things, but I still couldn't hang, right? Like I just couldn't hang with it. And I felt like I have to figure out how to make it through this. And I think a lot of gay men who went through the 80s have that response of like, I don't know, like I've done all the things and yet I'm still fucking miserable. And I still feel crazy like all the time. And so, so I went to Zen Hospice Project as a way to kind of figure out a different way to be with grief. And I've started volunteering with them, and through them I met somebody who started doing the Buddhist chaplaincy training program. So I did that, where I found my teacher, and that moved me into being a Zen monk, which that sort of surprised me too. And I lived 10 years in a monastery, training to be a priest, a Zen priest. So, but it all starts from this question of like, how do I live, right? How do I respond in a world that has told me my whole life what was expected of me, who I was supposed to be, but that doesn't match who I am, right? And the great thing about Buddhism was that they gave me permission to just be like, it doesn't, one, it's not permanent. So anything that I come up with doesn't have to be forever, right? Which was such a big deal for me. And also the permission to just not be sure, Like, I don't have to know the answer, right? Like, I sit down with people and I just have to say what's right in that moment. I don't have to say what's right for the rest of their life or the rest of my life. And that's so freeing when you realize, like, it just has to be real here. And I think our job as chaplains, and you do the same thing when you're meeting people where they are, you don't have to give them the solution for the rest of their life. You just have to help them get through the day, right? So, yeah.
Beautiful. I appreciate you each sharing your stories. I like to ground so much of what we do in the stories we share, and I imagine that, any number of you heard little bits and pieces that you might have resonated with, even unexpectedly, and you each, spoke deeply of the variety of religious and spiritual experiences that you've had, and the variety of things that you've explored. I liked this concept that you mentioned of not matching. And how, like, queer folk in spiritual communities will often, not always, right? Because there are, even now, spiritual communities where it's fine if you're queer, right? But often, queer folk experience that not matching, and it sort of sets us off on a journey of trying to discover for ourselves meaning making, what's real, where might we match.
But even within queer communities, right? Like, we put these expectations on each other as queers, right? So you go into a queer church and you think, like, okay, I'm going to be affirmed here. And when you're not affirmed there, because you're not the right kind of queer, or you're not wealthy enough, like whatever it is, we still separate each other out, right? Like being queer is not some magical panacea that fixes all of the things, right?
Shit.
And
Oh man, I thought for sure being queer was just all sorts of magic that was gonna make it better.
I still am waiting for my unicorn. I really want my unicorn. But so you go into even queer churches or queer spaces, and you realize. So even as a queer person now, a monk, who spent most of my life sort of examining and teaching about sexual health and sexuality and all of those things. And then at 55, realizing my entire life I've been asexual and had no clue. And then I spent, a number of years being celibate, even though my tradition doesn't require it. I decided I'm a monastic and I just wanted to be celibate, and not realizing that that probably has to do with being asexual. But, then developing the language. But then, like, people find out you're a gay, cisgendered guy who's asexual. Like, they're just like, what do you mean?
Talk about intersectionality. Ooh.
Well, and, what do you mean? And especially because, I do talk about sex in my teaching. I teach about sex, and I teach about sexual ethics and sexual health and how to have a healthy sex life. And then people find out that, yeah, and I don't have sex.
Well, but you also said that, things aren't forever. Right, and so that I like how that represents, as part of your practice and part of your spiritual knowledge, that you have been or you've engaged in other practices prior.
Oh, yeah.
You were going to say something, Claire.
I had no idea where I was going.
Okay, sorry.
I lost it. I got just lovely to listen, and yeah.
And I think the same thing when you're talking, so yeah.
Claire, would you talk a little bit about the trans faith initiative, trans care initiative that you've led at General, and what were some of the things that were most important and key to keep in mind when offering spiritual care to trans folk?
Yeah, I think part of the reason that we started the Trans Spiritual Care Initiative, I don't know how many of y'all know this, but 2013 was the year that trans health, so pre-2013, most health insurance plans had a trans exclusion in them. And so most health insurance plans would not cover any kind of affirming care. It was considered like extra. What Florida is trying to do right now, I think they've just passed legislation banning gender affirming care, i.e. our health care, from Medi-Cal, their version of Medi-Cal, their Medicare. And, so what that meant was back then it was like, every weekend it was a party for somebody's top surgery. It was like, I had it like line item in my budget for other people's healthcare because, or you're getting your hormones. I mean, we had some good clinics here in San Francisco, so you could get hormones at the clinics because of our public health system, but not, certainly back where I come from, it was a different story. Anyway, so what happened in 2013 when the law changed, and it changed because there was a court ruling that said that it was unconstitutional in the California Constitution. And then when Obamacare passed, the law changed throughout the country. And what happened here was like, it was like this explosion, because so many folks in my spiritual community are trans and non-binary. And it was like all of a sudden we had access, right? Like it was like, and so everybody was getting their top surgeries and, like getting hormones and, and people knew I was in training to be a chaplain. And so people started calling me with their stories about the shitty experiences they'd had with chaplains. And it was just, I was like, okay, so, so I did some advocacy and, I was in seminary at the time. So I was like calling, different spiritual care directors and trying to advocate and encourage different, encourage changes and all of that. And then when I got to Sojourn at the General and met the volunteers and the chaplains, I was like, oh, we need education too. This is everybody, And so brought together clergy from different traditions and leaders from different traditions and talked to them to kind of, what kind of curriculum do you think you would need to see that we need in the community, and then developed it and then reworked it. And I don't know, where am I going with this?
Some of the themes and that were important to keep in mind in offering care.
Thanks.
Well, I think
sorry
one of
guys,
the-
it's been a long day today, so my mind's a little like this.
And I just want to add that one of the things that was really important, I was part of the board that helped fund the initial pilot project, and was also that it's trans-centered, meaning all of the people who are giving the education are trans people.
Yeah, I mean,
And
it's
trans clergy. So we went to trans clergy and asked them to tell us about how to do that, right? How do we start to talk about this in healthy ways?
Yeah, I mean, and that was part of when we brought the cohort together and, we're looking at the curriculum, folks were like, we can't have cis people teaching this, because it's really different when cis people are teaching this and and we're very committed to always paying the consultants, and so everybody who's doing the teaching is getting paid, because I think one of the things that's exhausting about being queer, I'm sure you know this, other kinds of minorities in the room, it's exhausting always having to be the representative and the educator, right, in your circles, that are more mixed. And so I think there's a lot in the curriculum, and I encourage you guys to come. It's kind of just like good timing that we're doing this tomorrow. We don't generally do it for the public. We do it more for different groups, but this is an online training that we're doing that's open. And, I think there's a lot in terms of that I could talk about around unique needs that we have as trans folks. But, honestly, over the last 5 years, what I've spent a lot of time doing? Reminding people to use the right pronoun. You don't even...
Using the right pronoun is spiritual care.
Yeah, and it's really ridiculous that, it's that hard for folks. But it is, and it's just, exhausting. I think, it's hard enough to be in the hospital, but to be having to try to advocate for people to use the right pronouns and use the right names, it's extra, I think I'll just speak a little because, I think chaplains were known for end-of-life care and the work that we do for folks with folks at end of life, I should say. And I think that, many folks in the trans community face unique challenges around end of life. Often our identities are erased by family members. And so I think that's really common. And I think, we as you may know, there's hate crimes against trans people are common, and particularly Black trans women are some of the, this year the highest number of murders of trans women have been Black trans women. And so I think the intersections of racism, I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm sorry, guys. The erasure of identities, I think it's 13 trans folks this year who've officially been murdered in a hate crime. But the reality is, like, we don't know the numbers because so many folks have their identities erased at the end of their lives. And, I think other issues around handling of bodies, I know that's the concern that I come across a lot, is what's going to happen to my body, who's going to touch my body, what are they going to do to my body and, my body parts. I think that's not uncommon, not an uncommon concern, but for so many of us who've had surgeries or haven't had surgeries, there's a lot of concern around that at end of life, and certainly abuses or misuses. That's an issue.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate you sharing from your expertise and some of the things that your program focuses on, and thinking about spiritual care integrated with the whole global practical care needs.
Well, and also, I mean, poverty plays poverty plays such an important part in that as well, right? Like, some of the trans people that I've worked with have not had access to HRT or hormones and all of those things, and so they, in a lot of ways, have to defend their transness because they're not performing trans right.
Right. And, I think it's like you enter the hospital, right? You go into the emergency room. What happens? Your clothes get cut off, right? You come in as a trauma, right? Your clothes get cut off. They're doing all the things to help save your life or whatever, or you just get admitted, right? And then you're in a fantastic, fabulous, terrible gown, right? These hospital gowns, they make everybody gender neutral, which, like, I don't know, maybe that's the future, but, definitely not with hospital gowns. So I think that there's this way that, there's gender identity, right, which is our sense of ourselves. It's our internal sense of self, right? And then there's our gender expression. That's the way we express our gender. It's all our, fabulosity. And I think, what happens when we go into the hospital is you don't have access to the things that help you express your gender. And I think this happens for cis people too. Like, cis people, grandma's like, where's my makeup? I got to do my hair, right? Like, I don't feel right if I'm not presented, And so I think what happens in healthcare settings so often for us is people get misgendered, and, people are not perceived in the way that in our wholeness. And I think that's part of what we do as chaplains, is helping to push the medical team to see the patient in their wholeness, right? So it's not just the diabetic patient and, 24 or whatever, right? This is a person this is a person who has a whole life, who is so much more than their diagnosis, right? And I think in the same way we're pushing, as chaplains, I think, part of what we're doing with the Transgender Spiritual Care Initiative is trying to push chaplains to really be thinking about how can we use our authority as chaplains within the medical setting to push the entire medical team to be seeing trans people in their wholeness the same way that we push the medical team to see everybody else in their wholeness.
Thank you. I appreciate that sort of concept of what might have drawn many of you here. Like, maybe you're a queer person. Maybe you still have questions around how you're making meaning in the world and how you might be able to find, encounter, embrace your own wholeness, including questions of spirituality. Before we open to questions...
Well, and I want to say, too, like, I think that to extend
Yeah.
that further, right?
Mhm.
Like, as we think about queering spirituality,
Mhm.
right? Like, can we start to recognize that spirituality needs to start seeing people in their wholeness,
Mhm.
and not just based on the presentation or their even the ideas about what it means to be queer, or what it
Yes.
means to be trans, or what it means to be a,
Yes.
like, all of these things. As we start to talk about queering spirituality, yes, more and more denominations are opening themselves up to us, but they still don't see us as in our totality, in our wholeness, right? And I think that if we're talking about queering spirituality, that's the key to what makes it really open and inviting and inclusive and welcoming, is, do I see people in their wholeness? And that means whether, you know, it's around the intersections of race and gender, or class and privilege and all of, like, but seeing people in their wholeness. And that's what we as queer people can teach people, right? Like, we are magic, period. And that's what we have to offer, is demanding and teaching people how to see others wholly, both HOLY and WHOLLY.
That's beautiful. You answered my next question. I was going to ask, we talked a lot about the challenges of queer spirituality, but there are gifts as well. Before we open for questions, any other comments about the gifts of queer spirituality?
I want to acknowledge that we're in Ramaytush territory,
you.
Yalamu, here in San Francisco. And I want to acknowledge that in the context of this conversation because, you know, some of the early documentation actually made by the priests who led the genocide here, genocidal attempt, just right up the street here at Mission Dolores was where many folks were enslaved. The priests who documented their enslavement, they talked about, what did they call them? Joyas. Joyas was the word that they used to talk about the men who were women, and the women, the third gender folks, right? They talked about men and women's clothing. And Ohlone elders, there's a few who've written, but more talk about the history and the role of third gender people pre-colonization here in this land. And so I think it's important for us to remember as we celebrate Pride that before colonization, you know, there's a long history of pride on this land, and that pre-colonization, there was a unique role, there has been a unique role for trans and third gender and queer folks. And so I think, you know, I love the idea of queer and spirituality. I like it. And it's kind of like, there's a way that it's almost colonial to think about it that way too.
Indeed,
you know what I
yes.
mean? Like, it's like breaking it down is, you know, is again like kind of playing into that binary. So, you know, I think it's like, how can we kind of like, yeah. So I think it's important to acknowledge and honor the history of this land and the history of this place, and also the current struggles that the indigenous folks of this place are in for federal recognition from the government, to get their land back, that their sacred sites be protected. Many of them are under threat of development, including the West Berkeley Shell Mound, an effort I've been pretty involved with. And so, and I think thinking about, you know, solidarity with indigenous folks, both as a witch, it's very fundamental to part of what it means to be in good relationship with the land, and so an important part of my spiritual perspective. But I think also as a queer person, you know, it's how do we support these indigenous efforts for sovereignty and self-determination, and think about that as part of our queer movement and our queerness and our
queer
movement.
history.
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
you know, our queer history includes these indigenous people that, you know, in some ways open up opportunities for us that we don't even know.
Yeah, Yeah, and so when we talk about like the history of Pride, we talk often about Stonewall, or maybe here in San Francisco we talk about the Compton cafeteria riots, right?
Right.
But we can reach back beyond, right? We can keep going back further and find our history. There's I think it's ancient Jewish texts, 6 genders. They'd had 6 different genders in some of these ancient Jewish texts, and so there's a long history of queer identities. It's not a new thing, and I think
And when you look at the indigenous cultures around the world, almost every indigenous culture around the world has a queer component that is tied to their medicine, to their spirituality. And so it certainly is part of our history as queer people to recognize that. And everywhere in the world, I mean, literally any indigenous, when you go back to the indigenous in, parts of Africa, and you go to the indigenous in New Zealand, and you go to the Maori, you go to, in Tonga, the Fa'afafine, and so there's always this, wherever indigeneity existed, we were there.
Yeah, and I think it's important to hold some nuance and complexity around it. I think as a white witch, or a witch of European descent, it's, I think also claiming that history as my own is complicated, right? I think that there's colonial elements of that too. So I think it's just important to hold the nuance of it, hold
Thank
the
you.
nuance of it.
Of a number of the things that you've heard tonight, I would love to open to questions. Were there nuances that you wanted to ask about?
Or thoughts
Yes.
and reflections?
Thoughts and reflections?
Well, on the subject of the way that decolonization is a part of spirituality, I'd be curious to hear more about the way that comes into your practice individually, your personal practices, and the practice of the work that you do, of how your spiritual work contributes to decolonization.
You want to start?
Sure, I'll take that one first. So as a Buddhist who practices an Americanized form of Japanese Buddhism, part of my vows are threefold. One is to do no harm, and to live and be lived for the benefit of all beings. So the only way, as a white cisgendered male, in order for me to fulfill that vow, requires me to look at decolonizing. And my commitments to racism, to colonialism, to capitalism, to the patriarchy, to all of those things. And so it's fundamental to my practice and the way that I view practice. Now, there are lots of Buddhists in the world who don't think that way and who will want to argue with me, but they never win the argument because I actually went to school and studied this stuff. So, but I think it's fundamental to if you're actually thinking in terms of I want to not harm and I want to benefit all beings, the only way I can do that is to look at what it means to be a white male in the United States and the effects of that. And then to start to operate in ways that unpack that and decolonize that. So that, what does it really mean to be anti-racist, not in a performative kind of way, but in an active kind of way, right? How do I unpack my own history, right? And how do I make sure that I'm centering something besides myself?
You'd said that you were involved in the West Berkeley Shell Mound cause very intimately.
Yeah.
What are some of the other concrete ways that you manifest this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just to kind of piggyback a little, I will say that there's a deep personal commitment to interrogating the ways in which white supremacy and, racism and colonization like plays out in my thinking and in my life, and being honest with myself about that. Like, I think that's, I've been a part of a spiritual community that I recently stepped away from, partially because it was so difficult for some of the folks in that community, some of the white folks in that community, to like admit that they were racist and that there was racist shit they were doing. And I was like, this is like the first step, you know? I think the first step is acknowledging that, you know, this is the world we live in, it's the water we swim in, and it's part of my journey in this body is to be in a process of unlearning. And I think that that looks like a lot of different things for me as a witch and a person who practices earth-based religion, trying to find, you know, being in relationship with Indigenous people in the place where I live feels important. Being in relationship in a way where I'm in service and not trying to be in leadership is another important way, and in support, following the lead of particularly Indigenous people, but you know, I think people of color in general is an important part of my path. Like it's a spiritual work, I think, for white people, or at least I'll speak for myself. You know, for me as a white person, you know, not you know, there's so many ways that, you know, I think whiteness teaches that I should be a leader and that I should be in charge, and, you know, like teaches me to want that. And so I think some of it is a spiritual practice of following, you know, learning how to follow and learning how to like recognize that impulse within myself, and work against it.
And I think also what you said at the beginning, right? Like to recognize that this is fucked up is a spiritual practice, right? To just acknowledge, like, this is fucked up.
And I think we can do that in our practices, right? Like, I mean, I think in earth-based communities, you know, there's a lot of ways in which, you know, modern paganism is kind of, it's an old religion, right? But it's also very new. And I think recognizing when there's cultural appropriation happening, naming it, and, you know, there's a lot of different steps to kind of go from there. But I think, you know, being willing to piss people off a little bit and, you know, and talking about it, I think is important. And also fucking up, you know, I think we're swearing here, so I'm just going to keep going, you know, because I got us started. But I think, you know, just recognizing that, like, I'm gonna do racist shit. I'm gonna do stupid shit, you know, and like, and letting that be part of my journey and be part of my spiritual practice to fuck up and make amends. And, you know, that may look like repair with an individual person. It may look like, you know, honoring a boundary and doing the work within myself to make sure that it doesn't happen again, you know. And it, you know, it sucks. It's hard. It's really hard work, you know, but I think it's important, and it's important to think of it as spiritual work. You know, I'm in a hospital, and there's a lot of conversation happening right now around, you know, what does it look like to be anti-racist in a healthcare setting? And, you know, there's a whole longer conversation there, but I think, you know, the key takeaway is really recognizing that, like, there is a sacredness in making mistakes and taking steps to make things right.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions, reflections, something that came up for people in the audience?
Well, and I also want to say before we get off of this, I just want to say, I think also our work as chaplains, as clergy people, you know, we spend a lot of time asking questions of other people. But I think it's really beneficial when we start to ask ourselves these questions, right? What do I believe? What's important to me? Who do I want to be in this world, right? And that's how we begin that process, asking ourselves the questions that we ask other people, right? When we ask our patients, well, what do you believe about God? You know, because I can't serve you until I know what you believe about God. So and then being able to go in and start to, but do that for myself too, right? Like interrogate myself and interrogate my beliefs on a regular basis to just see where it is that, what is it that I believe? What is it that I think? Like, I don't think we really ask ourselves that enough.
Thank you. There was a hand over here somewhere. Yes.
So in Buddhism, it's really common for you to hear things like, there is no self, which is not what the Buddha said. What the Buddha said was, there's no abiding, non-interconnected self, right? So for me, what that comes down to is allowing myself the room to change and grow as I mature, as I learn, as I get new information, right? So when I came out in the 70s, there were gay men, lesbians, and trans people. That was it, right? And that was our community. Now, you know, and maybe bisexuals, but we... Right. They were really just going through a phase. But now, right, like, we know more. We know better. And so people's ideas and understandings get to expand. You know, and so that's how we do that, right? Like, to recognize that I'm always going to grow and change as I get new information as to what are the possibilities here, right? Because if you can't, you can only imagine what you can see. But then you meet new people and you start to develop new relationships and you find out new information and you find out about all this cool shit and you find out about non-binary people and all of that stuff and you go, oh wow, that's really cool. Maybe, is that me? No, that's not really, like, you know, so that's what I would say, is to just leave room for there to never, you don't have to stay wherever you are.
Thank you. We've reached time, but I know I will be here for a little bit after the session, and I don't know if you'll be around here talking with the sisters and other friends. I also just want to recognize, before we close, a couple other people in the room. Bonnie Violet is also a chaplain, can be found online at A Queer Chaplain. And Bonnie is leading the first ever spiritual drag con in Chicago later this year in October. And Scott Sessions is also a spiritual accompanier and is helping folks come to their own understandings of meaning making, and queer folk in particular, of who they are and how they want to practice today. This coming Sunday, you can find me in the Castro on Sunday evening. It is Juneteenth, but we will also be having the second annual Castro Drag Street Eucharist. And so all the leaders, participants, homileticians, presiders, etc. will be there in fabulous drag. And you'll all be invited, if you attend, to walk the runway of the Spirit as we close. Whoever you are, however you are, in drag, out of drag, the runway accepts you. Please, please, precious, come on up and close us out.